And thanks to everybody for joining. Thanks too to Hillary Jones for good work in putting this session together. I'm glad to see everybody today. In recent years, the work of the campaign has largely been driven by concern about learning loss, and especially about the learning losses that have been experienced disproportionately by young people from economically challenged and historically marginalized families and communities. The reports and test results keep coming in. They keep telling us the same broad story, that learning loss is real, that learning loss is persistent, and it is most persistent for certain groups of young people. That is the big story and the big concern. And you know that the campaign won't turn away from that reality. We intend to keep bringing forward the evidence that we're not doing as well as we must with early school success, and that we need to do more to close those gaps for the kids. At the same time, that's not the only story. There are places that have done a lot better than the national story, that have overcome the obstacles, beaten the odds, and have made real progress in shrinking the crucial gaps. And those places and those stories are really important to us. Which is why we want to take today's session to zoom in more and to learn more about and from those places that are seeing outsized progress. Those stories reaffirm and reinforce our belief that this work is doable, that progress is indeed possible. Bad outcomes are not inevitable, they're not inexorable. Progress is neither a fantasy nor a mirage. And that reality buoys our spirits, and it provides us the energy for the work ahead. But it isn't just about how we feel. It's really about understanding what accounts for the increased progress in certain schools and certain communities. And that's what we've explored in a number of GLR sessions over a set of years now. On October 8th, we actually had a webinar that looked at data insights around progress and lack of progress nationally. And there was some hint in that conversation about places that were doing better, but we didn't get to really delve into some of the most promising results in particular places. It felt like we hadn't really completed that conversation. So we're back at it today with a specific intent to dig into some of the success stories that our friends at Curriculum Associates, McKinsey, and EdTrust have uncovered. And as we look at those stories, we want to explore these three questions. What strategies and approaches did these districts and communities employ? That's number one. Number two, what made implementation of those strategies and approaches successful in those communities? And then number three, what can folks in the GLR network do to create the right conditions for the adoption of the right strategies and high quality implementation of those strategies in their communities? Now, we got a terrific set of guests to help us with our learning journey today. I'm going to give them to you alphabetically. Eric Duncan is the Director for P12 Policy at EdTrust, specializing in policies related to educator quality and increasing the racial diversity of the educator workforce. Emmy Liss is a senior advisor with McKinsey & Company's education practice. She co-authored McKinsey's recent research on global education transformations. Doug Scott is a senior expert in McKinsey's global education practice, where he supports K-12 and higher ed clients seeking to expand opportunity and increase equity across the United States and globally. And finally, Kelsey Young leads the research and insights and analytics team at Curriculum Associates, conducting research and evaluating national trends and local trends, as we will see, in student achievement. Now, just to keep everyone on their toes, we'll be talking to our guests in exactly the reverse order from the way we just introduced them. Go figure, the difference between alphabetical order and logical discussion, let's say. Kelsey, overcoming the power of the alphabet. Let's start with you. Can you join us on screen?
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. I was always last in classes and everything, so this is exciting to get to go first. So.
Yeah, you get to lead off today. So Curriculum Associates, thanks so much for being with us. Curriculum Associates identified a set of school districts in lower income cities that were exceeding expectations immediately post-pandemic. And then you all conducted extensive interviews among those districts to find out the common practices that they engaged in. So can you start out by telling us a little about the 6 districts you focused on? And I would say to start with, they're not perhaps the most likely suspects. So take it away.
They are not. Yeah, I'm gonna do kind of a high level overview of first how we found these districts or these schools that we were talking to, and then kind of dive into some of the practices we found. And unfortunately, shocker, they're not surprising. They're not hugely novel. They're not magical. They're things we know they should be doing. They just found some success in implementation. Um, so moving along to kind of the approach for this research, we wanted to focus on districts who we knew were hit hard from the pandemic, like you were mentioning, John.
Yep.
Those in lower income communities and then serving a large proportion of students of color. We know that the pandemic had, in many cases, exacerbated inequities. So we wanted to find places where schools and districts were kind of bucking that trend. So we found schools in which students, specifically students who were 2 or more grades behind in the beginning of the year, made larger than expected growth across the year. So we found all those schools and then interviewed their district leaders and then kind of collated the common practices they said they were engaging in. Jump ahead. So finding these schools meant looking at our own iReady data, so diagnostic data, it's a benchmark assessment, and then seeing after we account for some school level characteristics that we know are going to influence student performance levels, where are there schools in which students are growing substantially more than we'd expect them to? And we found quite a few across the nation actually broken out by subject with some overlap in schools that were exceeding expectations in both math and reading. Keep moving. And then from these schools, we ended up interviewing about 16 across the country. And we tried to get schools in different regions, locales, serving different students to get a variety in the schools that we were chatting with. And then if you jump ahead to the next one, you can kind of see the overlap in those. These schools included some elementary or middle schools. And again, in these 16 schools, most were in lower income communities and serving a majority of students of color. So if we jump into the next one, what we found were kind of these 6 buckets of promising practices that schools engaged in that they cited as supporting their better than expected growth post-pandemic. Now, like I said, unfortunately, none of these are mind-blowing or novel or magical practices that you've never heard of. I'm sure all of these look very familiar. They're all things we know support schools and students, but can be rather challenging to implement. So I'm going to quickly review them and then give some examples of what school leaders said these looked like or sounded like in their school. And then I believe Hillary had already shared the report, so you can find more details about what that looks like. So a big first one we know is really important, holding a mindset that supports student success. This looks like educators believing that all students, regardless of background or circumstance, can achieve at high levels. That educators are responsible for and can contribute to the learning and growth of all of their students. And that educators are really doing whatever they can, including thinking outside of the box to support the success of all of their students. And so one, I think, really simple thing that a school leader had said that helped contribute to this mindset was simply unpacking deficit thinking, or really having their educators switch their mindset or change their language to be less deficit-based and more strength-based. Now, the next practice we kind of saw was this idea of creating a culture of data. So not just engaging in obtaining data, but supporting a culture and conversation around that data. So this included PD to help support effectively incorporating data into daily practice, regular meetings to discuss data, identify ways to respond to that data, defining norms and expectations around the use of that data and how it drives improvement for our students, and then having champions of data to kind of support that culture and building that culture, and then involving students in that conversation. So for some schools, this looked like building a framework of plan, do, study, act, or just simply how they wanted to utilize that data to build lessons and support student learning. For others, this meant PD or PLCs dedicated to understanding and successfully using that data. Now, the next one we saw, and something I think that was especially emphasized post-pandemic, but meeting the needs of the whole child, which looks like districts or school leaders providing material resources for students and families, ensuring the right people, structures, and systems are in place to support students academically, socially, emotionally, and then carefully selecting new curriculum products and instructional programs to support students' learning and growth. What we heard school leaders do to address this range from adding an assessment for SEL, engaging in kindness challenges school-wide, hosting shoe drives, changing how they scheduled the school day, starting with intervention blocks and scheduling things around these to prioritize this really critical period for a lot of students. Next, we heard these schools reporting that they were working really hard to create a school environment that engages and inspires students. What this looked like was school leaders setting expectations that teachers cultivate relationships, that incentives are used to increase student engagement and motivation to achieve both academic and non-academic goals, and that educators were using pedagogical practices that increase student engagement in the classroom. So how schools were doing this were incentives for meeting reading goals. Like I was saying, a very, very heavy emphasis on relationship building with their students, encouraging students to take ownership over their learning, and then utilizing some peer learning practices so students could experience more autonomy and ownership over how they engaged with their learning. And then next, we heard these schools saying there was a focus on supporting teacher practice in a variety of ways, including school leaders providing resources and opportunities designed to increase content knowledge, shift mindsets, improve instructional practice, facilitate data interpretation, or just how to use the instructional resources they had more effectively. Recognizing the value of academic support coaches and interventions in supporting teachers in their role, and then providing additional support, especially to newer teachers. What this looked like was regular PD, including PD that just targeted shifting educator mindset. So back to kind of that first overarching practice we talked about. Hiring and successfully utilizing instructional coaches, having what some called content PLCs. So especially for new teachers to kind of hone these strategies, their content knowledge, or review data, and then providing specific structures for lesson planning just to kind of reduce the burden of that practice. And then the last practice we saw or heard was a very common one that I think was a struggle, but also became very needed during the pandemic, was this connection between schools and families. So this incorporated simply involving families in their child's learning, and then having an expectation that educators would build relationships with families by maintaining regular communication. So schools reported this looked like at-home reading challenges that caregivers had to sign off on, hosting family or literacy nights at the school, trying different tools to facilitate that regular communication. And then I think especially during the pandemic, basically having kind of IT support for caregivers who had questions about how to access assignments, use a Chromebook, or other tasks necessary to support their child's learning at that time. So that is kind of the overview of those, but I know we have some colleagues who also have more insights into some of those practices as well. So Sean, I'll pass it back to you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Kelsey. That was a great start. I have a couple other quick questions for you before we turn to Doug. Can you say exactly when this research happened? It post-pandemic. So how far post-pandemic was this?
The end of the 21 school year. So post-pandemic is even kind of a little generous because we know fall of 2020 was still a little disrupted. But we looked at growth targets or student growth across the 20 to 21 school year. And so we knew that was a particularly challenging year because if students were back in person, it was sometimes only part-time, or it was later that fall that they were back in person.
And then the other follow-up around that timing is, do you have the sense that districts were using core resources or special resources to pursue these strategies?
That's a really good question that I wonder if we have insight into. I think at the time, if I'm remembering right, I mean, maybe a mix of both, because I think we had some core resources that we had to rely on because we were just getting back to school and we were still kind of figuring out this COVID funding, who's getting dollars for what, how should these be used during the 2020 to 21 school year. So I don't know if there's a lot of room or timing, given how close it was post-pandemic, to really explore supplemental or external resources at the time. But that's
Gotcha.
something that I would love to dive deeper into.
Gotcha. I want to ask you one more question, Kelsey, and then it's going to be a sort of a segue to what Doug and Emmy want to talk about, which is you did a great job of presenting those 6 strategies. And just as you said, they are not obscure, they're not surprising.
Yeah.
They are the meat and potatoes
Yeah.
of essentially how you get kids to perform better, right? And create the right kind of atmosphere and culture. Did you learn anything in your interviews about why you think these places were more successful with their implementation than other places might have been? And this is something we're going to come back to. So
Yeah.
if you have further thoughts later, but just a few opening thoughts on why these strategies,
Mhm.
which we all believe in and subscribe to, turned
Yeah.
out to be more successful in these places than in other places.
Yeah, I think this is going to be something we'll have a further conversation about, but it is that implementation piece. I think they have school leaders and a culture that I don't know if it was just they had a lot of champions to promote these practice changes or engaging in these practices, or what the key implementation factor was for them, or if it was just like a really nice alignment between here's the practice we want to put in place and we are a culture who's ready for adoption. I think it could have been a few of those things, but it was that implementation piece and that really strong school leader who had ideas in mind of how to do this given their unique circumstances and their unique barriers.
Great, great, great. Thanks so much. And as we let you go for a little bit, I'll just note there's a question from Susan in the box about the reading thing. And if you could answer that with your fingers now, and if you think there's something to say about it later, come back to it. Meanwhile, Doug, can I get you to come on screen? Thanks so much, Kelsey. We're continuing to work backwards in the alphabet here. And now we've got Doug Scott from McKinsey with us.
Yes.
But thanks so much for joining us, Doug. You guys did a kind of a similar undertaking with the distinction that you did this across the world. So,
Yes.
can you tell us a little about the venture, the report, and then give us an overview of the framework that you developed to think about all this?
Yeah, no, my pleasure, and great to be with you all today. So it's interesting. We did do a global look, and I think of Spark and Sustain, which is what we'll talk about here, and I have a copy back here, as a bit of the Return of the Jedi of a trilogy of reports that we did, right? So back in, I think it was 2007, we did a report that tried to answer the question, what are the best school systems out there doing? And it found a lot of things related to teacher quality and things like that. And then, but a lot of the pushback was like, it's really interesting to know what the folks who are great now are doing. But what you really got to do is tell me, how do I get there? And that's where the second one, which I have here, which is how the world's most improved systems got there. That was our sort of second report. And this sort of took the question of what are systems that have made sustained change at scale systematically, and what ingredients made that possible, and it sort of looked at these journeys of, are you on a poor to fair journey or a fair to good, good to great, and really thinking about, depending on where you start, changes what you do to get to where you're going. And then a couple years back, we said, look, it's been a while since we did that. It's been a while since we took a global look. And what are we learning? And a lot has changed in education. So we sort of wanted to retest some of these hypotheses and get back out there and learn about what's going on with systems globally. And I'd say the first sort of centering page, kind of, John, to your intro is, on the one hand, it can look pretty rough out there. And if you look at these numbers, we looked at how many systems across the globe have gotten better, gotten worse, or stagnated over the past decade, 2010 to 2020. And you see a lot of decline and stagnation, right? So you sort of wish there were a lot more improvers. But then we said, look, what can we learn from the folks that improved, and set out and did a series of interviews with, I think it was 200 plus interviews with system leaders, funders, folks in the space to really sort of get under what are these systems doing that are helping them to make the improvement and sustain it over time. Again, with the idea of what can we all learn from that.
Can I ask you a quick methodological question here? What measures across countries did you use for success or lack of success for schools?
So, we're sometimes constrained by the data that's out there. We looked at the international academic assessments, right? And I think we would be the first to acknowledge that those are, on the one hand, helpful guides, but on the second hand, by no means the end all and be all, right? It is a helpful roadmap to compare systems, but then you really do have to get deeper to have the conversation. So that was the data used to pick the systems, and then a lot of quantitative and qualitative deep dives within them.
Okay, and then you did, once you identified the systems, then you went to this round of interviews for a large scale qualitative piece of work. Is that
yes, to sort of understand what they did, how they did it, and what sort of the ingredients that seem common across the systems.
great? Perfect. Thanks.
Excellent. No, my pleasure. So what we did, if we go to the next slide, we sort of boiled out what we found into these four chunks that reinforce change. The first is, I think what you just described, John, is the meat and potatoes, like the what, right? What are we supposed to be doing? And it feels like, anyway, over time, we've gotten more and more and more consensus of like, there's less and less question about what should we do? And it's more like, but how are we really going to do it? And how are we going to implement it effectively? So that's what we found as we went through this. And I'll briefly touch on the what, but then really want to emphasize the things we learned on the how front. And I think that'll be a great segue to have Emmy really bring this to life with some very specific examples.
Perfect.
Because sometimes these hows sound like, oh yeah, we're already doing that. But when you get under an example or two, it really kind of illustrates it more effectively.
Yep. Great.
So if we look to the next page, you'll see how we describe sort of the what. And a lot of this, I think, resonates with what you were talking about, John, and Kelsey, some of the things you highlighted, right? You see the emphasis on academics, high quality instructional curriculum. You see the focus on whole child. You see the emphasis on teacher quality, teacher development. You see, what are we doing with performance management and data? And then obviously these enabling factors around resource allocation, governance, and operations. So this, I think, is like, yes, we found it and it's common, but when we looked at what we're really learning from this report, this wasn't the sort of the light bulb. This was like, yep, it feels like there continues to be more and more consensus about what we're trying to do. What we really then spent most of the report diving into and illustrating is the sort of what holds systems up from making change or what they're doing to enable it. And what we've listed on the next one is sort of these sort of big chunks of the how that systems struggle with, and this came from a series again of those 200 interviews. So one, conflicting directions, right? We don't know where we're going. We don't know what's important. In some systems, like there's different levels of how important is education. What is the purpose of education? Sometimes there's these really lofty goals way out in the future that no one really understands. There's just not a coherence about what are we doing, where are we going, and why. Leadership discontinuity, that probably doesn't need much more said about it. We've seen that sustained reform takes 8 to 12 years. If you think of systems and countries and districts that have done it, it's hard to build that in. Some systems have sort of solved it without it being a stable superintendent, if you will, but that's really tough. And every new person changes the direction of the system, which causes a whipsaw effect. The third is stakeholder engagement, right? It's kind of this organ rejection of almost no matter what you're doing, if you didn't talk to me about it, I have a problem with it. And how can we be better at engaging and bringing stakeholders along and getting their thoughts to make the answer better. The fourth is the strategy stuck on a shelf, right? Sure, we did this report or we did this strategic plan. I don't remember what's in it. We haven't talked about it. We aren't moving. Limited capacity, right? That's always going to be a challenge, but how do we get more of the right people focused on the right things? Flying blind speaks very much to Kelsey's point on data, right? This idea of like, what data are we measuring? Are we using it? Are we focused on it? Are we using it effectively? Versus just sort of like, we're doing a lot of stuff. I can't tell you what's working. We're not talking about data. We're talking about anecdotes, and that really gets systems stuck. And then lastly, sort of this sense of just being stuck in the past, right? Like as much as there are these sort of hows that the what's, sorry, that you're trying to pursue, things change. I mean, we've all gone through a ton of change in the last few years. Where should you adapt and where should you stay the course, and how do you do that thoughtfully? And again, you can get stuck and be standing still. So these were the things that came up time and time again in these interviews with, 40, 50, 60% of leaders we interviewed citing those as issues. And then I think what you'll see on this is just we then translate that in to the things we see in the systems that actually are getting things done. So the first three fall into how am I building a durable coalition for change, bringing clear and consistent priorities based on evidence, engaging and empowering leadership, and doing that really hard but critical work to change hearts, minds, and behaviors amongst internal and external folks. Creating that delivery capacity. So not just the strategy, but like what's the plan and the infrastructure and the drumbeat to track progress and really make sure things are happening? And what's the sort of people capacity and expertise to actually execute? And then lastly, again, using data sort of in two ways. One, data-driven decisions at every level. And two, this adaptability point, flexing and understanding what's changing in the landscape so that you can adjust your strategy as you go. So this felt to us like a really helpful way to think about the things that these progressing systems were doing. And I think a good thing for us to talk about later as pretty instructive as we're all trying to bring about change where we are. I think the best thing to do to bring this to light is to dive in on a few examples, which I'll hand it over to Emmy to do.
All right, that sounds great. Emmy Liss is Doug's colleague, and she can talk about some of what these examples of success are. And following on what Doug said, we're hoping that she will bring to light some of the things that make the difference, really make the difference between those places that succeed and those people that use maybe the same strategies but don't succeed. Emmy? No, I'm not seeing you, Emmy.
No, I am. I think I may need to be permitted to take myself back on video. Okay, there we go. All right. Thanks so much, John. And in keeping with your backwards flow through the order, I might actually make a last minute request to do my 2 slides in reverse, if it's possible, just to jump to slide 25 with the global map.
Let's keep it lively. Good.
Yes. So Doug highlighted just the scale of research and engagement that we did in pulling together this report, talking with folks from all over the world in the countries that you see highlighted here. That reflects places where we either did interviews or collected survey results. And in the report, ultimately, we profiled 14 countries and regions in detail. We selected those countries and regions to profile based on about a decade's worth of data from the decade immediately preceding COVID, about 2009 to 2019, looking at systems that had made sustained improvement over that decade. And we wanted to look at a couple of different categories of systems in order to capture lessons that would be relevant to folks all around the world. So we looked among the systems that take international assessments like PISA and some of its counterparts, and identified systems that had made sustained gains over about a decade. And that led us to profile places like Singapore, Estonia, Poland. We also looked at more of the emerging regional assessments in, for example, Africa and Latin America, where there has not been historically the same participation in a test like PISA, but we see newer assessments, and we were able to similarly capture where there had been a decade or more of sustained progress. That led us to look at places like Kenya, Malawi, Morocco, and in Latin America, Peru. We also looked in places and parts of the world, the US being a great example of this, where education really is best understood at the regional level rather than the national level. We looked at regional assessments. So in the US, we looked at NAEP, which led us to profile Washington, D.C. and Mississippi. And we also profiled elsewhere, London and Sierra, Brazil. And across all of these case studies, the themes that Doug highlighted resonated. And I think what that really illustrated for us is that whether you are talking about a system with millions and millions of children, or a tiny island like Singapore, whether you are looking at some of the most advanced educational countries, places that have been top performers for decades like Norway, or if you are looking at places that are really still just emerging, like some of the sub-Saharan African countries we profiled, these same lessons of implementation apply. And what that illustrates for us through these case studies is that there are lessons to be taken at every system of every scale. So if we go back to the slide with a couple of systems, there are a few particular lessons we wanted to highlight. This one right here, yes. And so just taking each of the chunks from the framework that Doug shared, just to highlight from our report, these first two examples, Washington, D.C. and Mississippi, and then the third case study, the third example, I'll highlight here, comes more from actually my own personal experience, not necessarily from our report. So Washington, D.C. is a great example of the different levers underneath the sort of broader framework of building a durable coalition for change. In Washington, D.C., over the course of about a decade, we saw really significant transformation in results, both in student performance, but also in student enrollment. Washington, D.C. had been experiencing 40 plus years of enrollment decline as public confidence in the school system waned. And through a series of reforms in the early to mid 2000s, the school system was able to both boost performance and really enlist families and community members as partners in the education system. What this looked like in practice is that particularly under Kai Henderson, who served as chancellor of the DC public school system, the system invested in really meaningful and authentic engagement with communities. As she stepped into the role of chancellor and had to develop a new strategy for the system, she first spent months doing listening tours, and not just in a perfunctory way, but really deeply listening to community members, soliciting feedback from them in the places where they lived and worked in their communities, and providing them with multiple ways to provide feedback on the system's strategy. And that led to a really community-informed approach to school reform. That lent itself well in moments of success, but also in challenging moments. The district had to make some really tough choices about school closures as enrollment patterns in the district had shifted. But under this community engagement approach, the district took a much more community engagement minded approach to school closure, and went out to communities and asked them in consolidated schools, what would they want to see? What would they want to look different? And that led to, I'm not going to say completely happy reactions, because school closures are always really challenging for communities, but far less backlash than had been experienced in prior years. And the system was able to not only sustain, but also grow enrollment even through that tough period. Mississippi is another fantastic example we highlighted in the report. Mississippi had the lowest reading scores in the United States in the early 2000s, and over the past decade has emerged as the fastest improving state in the US as measured by NAEP, and one of the few states that was able to sustain literacy performance through the pandemic. In the early 2000s, though, the picture was not great. The state had what some of its leaders would describe as a culture of low expectations, and a teacher workforce that was sort of overdue for some new training in approaches to reading and literacy. In 2012, the state passed new laws around literacy and early childhood education, really one of the first, as we've now seen this wave of state legislation around the science of reading. But as we think about this particular lesson around delivery capacity to scale, what Mississippi did was they turned that law into practice by consistently working with districts across the state to move outcomes. The state invested really heavily in coaching which is something we see as a trend across the country. One thing they did that was quite different from how many other states or districts have approached this is that literacy coaches were employed directly by the state rather than districts to ensure a higher degree of consistency, to make sure that there was a high bar for quality. And those coaches were deployed to districts in a manner that allowed the whole state to really move forward, both the districts that had been most deeply struggling, where coaches were, where there was more intense coaching provided, and then districts that were doing a little bit better were given more autonomy over what some of that improvement work looked like. The last example I want to highlight, as I said, comes from my personal experience. I saw a number of folks from New York City in the chat. Always good to be in good company. I previously worked for the New York City Department of Education as part of the team that helped scale up universal pre-K here in New York City. That scale up was rapid. For folks who are not familiar, New York City went from serving about 19,000 children in free full day pre-K in 2014 to about 70,000 4-year-olds just 18 months later. And during that rapid scale up, I think there are often folks who worry about how you can maintain both or sort of manage up both access while maintaining quality. And I think New York City was able to do this with a really heavy reliance on data in both the access and quality aspects of that work. So on the access side, there were really detailed analyses done to understand where the need was greatest for new pre-K capacity across the city by looking at census data, past enrollment trends, patterns from other places around the country like Washington, D.C. and Boston that had scaled up universal pre-K already. And looking at really granular community data about language access and housing insecurity to understand how best to reach families. New York City undertook a really robust campaign-like effort, leveraging city data to understand not just the number of 4-year-olds in the city, but to gather up the contact information for literally every rising 4-year-old in the city so that the city could reach out to families directly and make them aware of the availability of pre-K in their neighborhoods. At the same time, there was this really dedicated focus to quality. The city used a number of different measures to understand what the quality of instruction looked like in each pre-K classroom, in particular leveraging nationally normed assessment tools like CLAS and ECHRS, but also observation data. We used all of that data to assign a dosage of coaching. So very similar in some ways to Mississippi's literacy work, but New York City deployed a team of instructional coaches to every pre-K program in the city. Some programs received coaching as often as biweekly, others received coaching quarterly, and that dosage was informed by data. We were also able to deploy social workers using data on child poverty and other demographic measures to make sure that programs that would need the most support, we thought would need the most support with behavioral and social emotional issues, were able to get it. And in sharing these lessons, and as I noted in the report, and we can go back to the map in our appropriate slide order now. In the report, we do highlight the ways that each of the 14 systems that we profiled deployed the various practices in this framework to ensure that they not just made progress, but did so in a sustaining way.
Wow, that's fantastic, Emmy. Thanks so much. Really appreciate that and want to come back to you shortly. But our friend Eric has been waiting patiently. So Eric, can I get you to join now?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, thank you for being patient, my friend. We worked it backwards in the alphabet, and you usually get called on first or early, and this time not so much. So thanks. We're eager to hear from you. This is so interesting because what my perception is we're listening here is we are talking about systems, and systems, well, you can do it this way, you don't have to stack it, exist sort of between policy and community, right? And your focus at Ed Trust is on K-12 policy stuff. So I am particularly interested to hear from you about how you create the policy framework that creates the possibility of doing the kind of work that Kelsey and Doug and Emmy just described. And then after we get that business about the policy framework, I want to turn to what's the role of community and coalitions and activists like those folks who are part of the CGLR network in this. But let's start with you on policy. You're at the forefront of driving towards equitable conditions for learning for all students, including especially those young people who are growing up in economically fragile and historically marginalized community. So I'm curious how you see this nexus of policies, districts opting for the best strategies, successful implementation, all the while keeping your eyes on equity.
Absolutely. No, thank you for that intro. And it was easy to be patient and wait to speak because of the way that my colleagues sort of set this up. So excited to kind of dive in and share a little bit from the Ed Trust perspective. And for those of you who don't know Ed Trust, thanks, John, for that intro. I won't go into too much depth because I think you laid it out really well. But we're really committed to dismantling some of the racial and economic barriers, like John brought up, that are sort of baked into our education system. And so our work with as John brought up, community, schools, systemic leaders, is really about equity, right? And equity is at the forefront, and fundamental to that, and what we really believe in, and how we sort of drive, to John's point, some of the conversations at the local and state level about what systems and policies need to be in place to better support all students. We think about education resource equity, right? In addition to some of the inequities we see across our education system, across our society, around the economic conditions that we see that have impacted our communities. We really see how that shows up at the school level, right? And we use data, and we're a data-centered organization, so it's fundamental to the work that we do. But we really want to look at data in terms of what are the inputs that we see at the systemic and school level that are necessary to sort of drive the success for all students that we want to see. And so part of that is, in terms of resource equity, how much districts spend. So that's obviously fundamental to this, but also how well they use resources to support student experiences. And in particular, when we look at we really go deep into the data, we will start to see some of the inequities that may not show up when we look at sort of what Emmy brought up, which is, this national data or sort of this broader data, but really looking deep into how much, resources and what is the type of resource allocation that we see at the school and local level. So if we move into that data question where we start on the next slide, you'll see a sort of way that we walk through some of these data points and the data analysis for all of the leaders within our education system, including community leaders that are integral to supporting all of the students that we want to see be successful and have productive careers and end up bolstering our education and economic systems. So we always start with, in terms of our data stories, and ARE is our acronym for the tools that we use, the Alliance for Resource Equity, that I'll walk through in a little bit, but just want to frame this for you. And thank you, Hillary, for adding the ARE tools that I'll share a little bit further. But we look at it, and when we work with our advocates, we have this illustration that is part of the work that we do when we're exploring data. So we say, okay, we have two students in a similar district. One is from a low-income background at one school, student A, and then student B, non-free and reduced lunch student at another school, right? And so if we look at just the funding, right? If we look at when it comes to resource allocation and all of that, we say, where is there enough funding at these schools that are serving the students that need the additional funding to support some of their specific needs? We see the student A from a low-income background, when we look at funding, that their school spends more per pupil than school 2, and then has more staff and teachers. So if we start there, we can kind of say, okay, there's sufficient funding given what's needed. But if you look all the way at the end, you'll see that in school A, the test scores are a little different for students in terms of proficiency rate. We see school A much lower proficiency rate than school B. So how can we unpack this and look at some of the ways that other resources are allocated that are more predictive or more tied to student outcomes than just funding? So if we move on to our sort of next data point, where we look at a set of data, and district leaders do this and state leaders do this during resource allocation reviews. And so this is what we do with our community members, to just give them a sense of what conditions are actually taking place in each school. So if we move on to the next sort of data point. Okay, let's look at student experience when it comes to teachers, right? We look now at school 1, where 2 of 7 of the students classes are with a novice teacher, right? As opposed to 1 of 7 in student 2's classes are led by a novice teacher. So that gives us another data point because we know from the research that experience with high quality and diverse teachers and experienced teachers can be really supportive to student outcomes, but that's just one other data point. So if we move forward and again, looking at what is this school like, and what are some of the conditions beyond just student, spending per pupil? We have to look at school leaders, right? We started with teachers because of the direct correlation and the connection to student outcomes and in school success, but school leaders are equally important. So if we look at data over the course of a number of years at this school and look at what's the likelihood of this student having a novice principal, given what we've seen from this school over a number of years, right? What student A's likelihood of having a novice principal at any point, 62% versus student B, which is 40%. So we already see student A is attending a school with less experienced teachers and less experienced principals. Again, that doesn't mean that that automatically predicts that that student is not going to be successful in that school, or that school can't be as successful, but it gives us some more insight into the conditions and what we need to look at and address for where we are seeing these gaps and why they're showing up. Let's keep talking and moving on to some other data points that kind of can help us complete the picture and why we see some of these outcomes. So if you move on to, some of the other things that we want to see: high expectations, rich, empowering curriculum and materials, which our presenters have already brought up. One of the ways that we can look at this from data is the percentage of students that are enrolled in advanced coursework, right? We know from the data and from research that access to advanced coursework is predictive of better outcomes in terms of graduation rates and success moving forward. And we see student A attends a school where only 5% of students are enrolled in advanced math versus where student B is 39% are enrolled in advanced math. So again, layering on, we're starting to see some of the data conditions that we look at and what we want to sort of see as predictive or for sort of illustrative reasons for why we may see differences in some of the test scores and outcomes that we want to see. And even more, if we keep going into data and sort of uncovering, sort of our final sort of data piece. If we move on to the next data point, instructional time and attention. So, my colleagues sort of brought up some of the success that we saw in terms of the interventions that took place during COVID. Some with the use of COVID recovery funds, some with funds that were already in place. One of the things that we saw in terms of outcomes for students, when students had access during the school closures and the pandemic and recovery time to targeted intensive tutoring with a small group of students multiple times per week, with a teacher that was a teacher of record at the school, their outcomes were much sort of higher than students that didn't have that targeted and intensive tutoring. And so we see this is a school where 11 students are part of an intervention group, which is a little bit larger than we want to see, and only 1 time per week, versus student B is in a school where 3 students are in an intervention group in the students group, and they meet more frequently. So we're starting to see with the data starting with sort of the funding and staffing question, where do we see these resources being allocated at the school level to support students? And as we are starting to see and uncover through these data, there are areas in which this school and this district can really prioritize and start to, look at ways to not only, build out policy solutions to support schools and districts to execute on these things, but are able to sort of identify very strategically and upfront where are the areas in which we need to sort of focus. And as you'll see with our ARE toolkit moving forward, what are some of the things that districts and school leaders need to be asking and need to be sort of thinking about as they're trying to close some of the gaps that we see between schools within their districts. So starting with data, and I'll go quickly through the rest of the resources.
Right.
Thanks. Yeah. So
Go ahead.
no, we can, if you want to move on, we can talk through
No,
some of the dimensions that we.
Yeah, I'm curious, Eric, from where you sit in on a policy team, leading a policy effort, how do you think about the policy moves that a state legislature, the federal government, regulatory agencies can make that create the right information and incentives and structures to make the right moves possible?
Absolutely. So,
And including as our previous guests talked about, the right implementation possible. Like, oh yeah,
absolutely.
we can pick the right strategies all we want. Probably, lots of people pick the right strategies, only a few really succeed with them. So talk a little about how the policy framework creates the right conditions.
Absolutely. So data and data availability, data transparency are policies that we across the board are promoting. And so that's foundational. We want states to have a database of information about some of these key indicators disaggregated by race and ethnicity and by income level to sort of showcase some of these things so that once we go deeper into an analysis where we say, what's happening, one good example is empowering rigorous content. With this ARE toolkit, when you look at the data and you see that a small percentage of students are being enrolled in advanced coursework, what are the policies based on state conditions, based on local conditions that will effectuate change, right? So with something like this, what we've seen are and what we promote are opt-out policies, right? So doing the research and looking at sort of this, trying to empower students and put them into advanced coursework opportunities. What we've seen is that some of the lower expectations at times or teacher recommendations are sort of contributing to why certain students are not, being put into advanced coursework or provided those opportunities. So we try to promote opt-out policies, right? And we've seen this at the state level where it sort of takes the decision away from the teacher in the school and puts it onto the family and students to say, we'll opt you into this advanced, this AP course or onto this track, but you have the chance or choice to opt out. And what we see, and I can go into a little bit more details, politically, that policy solution is different in a place like Texas versus a place like, Massachusetts, where, we've been able to sort of move that in a way that's very intentional about supporting, vulnerable student populations in a state like Massachusetts versus Texas. We've said, this is more about all students. But either way, those types of policies are the sort of changes that create more of a school or a broader district level and school level difference, right? And so those are the types of policies that we identify through our resources that I think Hillary linked, and that's how we sort of approach each of these dimensions with policy solutions that are targeted towards like what is working, what works, and how to sort of navigate some of the political landscapes that different states and districts are trying to navigate to support students.
Awesome. Great. Thanks. I think I'm going to now invite everybody, Kelsey, Emmy, and Doug, to come back on screen. We'll all be here live now, I think. Emmy, you there? Yeah. Okay, great. So I think we've laid down a pretty stable foundation around policy. We've talked around the selection of effective strategies. We've talked some about quality implementation. I do have to say that when I was in this work, a friend who ran a big organization used to say that implementation is the new innovation. Like what we don't need is a bunch of new ideas. What we do need is some new strategies for doing the things that we already know work. And I think that is very, very true to this conversation. I wanted to come back, Kelsey, before we go, I want to go to what the role of community coalitions in all of this. And we'll talk about that for a second. But Kelsey, I wanted to come back to you after hearing Doug and Emmy and see if you had any additional observations about why you all thought some of these places were more effective in implementing smart strategies than other places that implemented the same smart strategies but less successfully.
Yeah, I think I really like the framing that Doug and Emmy were talking about. One, from viewing this at a systems level and looking at what systems we need to make change to see behavior change at this granular level. Because reality is we want behavior change. We want people to engage in these practices that we know work. And I think a lot of times we place that onus on educators because we want educators to engage in all of these evidence-based practices. But I think something that if we reflect on those 6 keys I discussed, most of those were kind of a culture shift that happened at the district and leadership level. And so, yes, we want educators to change their mindset, but it falls on district leaders, school leaders to empower educators to have access to those resources. Similarly with data, we want educators to use data. We want them to use that to inform their instruction. But the practice we really highlighted was not just use data, it's creating a culture of data. And so it is this, we know how to talk about it. We have champions of data. We have people providing PD for educators to know how to utilize that data to inform their instruction. And so I think thinking about it and breaking these things down by a systems level really helps us understand where we need to be targeting or really rethinking our implementation. Because I think that's going to be that key factor that's presenting some maybe schools or districts from benefiting from these practices that we know work, and others really seeing them through and realizing the benefits of practices that we know are evidence-based.
Right. So look, the campaign for grade level reading is mostly made up of community coalitions, more than 350 communities around the country, community coalitions that are dedicated to early school success, and also partner organizations of those coalitions and funders of those coalitions. So I want to turn now from the policy enablers from the strategies and implementation that are very system centric to the crucial role of community coalitions. It was funny, Doug and Emmy, when you presented, you said build a durable coalition, and that seemed to have 2 sides. One internally, like you need everybody going in the same direction, but then there was also a hint of an external, like you need a community coalition. Your story, Emmy, about what has happened right here in Washington, D.C., was illustrative of that. All of that, though, presupposes that the system is the moving party. And sometimes I wonder if the system is the responding party, and if the impetus for all this action and the guide of this action could actually come from community, that combination of informed demand and appropriate support and accountability that really lies at the heart of what the Campaign for Grade Level Readings Network is all about. So I'm curious, when you all think about how these things unfolded in the communities in which they unfolded, how you think about the role of community coalitions. And Doug, it's been a while since you talked, so and I see you nodding over there, so I'm thinking you're thinking something.
Yeah.
So let's hear from you, and then others. I really want to get into this is what our audience is all about. It's like, okay, good, I'm for all this. Yes, put me in. What can we do? What's our role? How can we lead here?
Yeah. No, it's a great question. And I think I think there's two parts to it for me, which is one, this question of where does it start, right? Does it start from leadership with community following along, or can it start with the community pushing it and then the system following along? And that's a first one, and I want to think a little bit more about that. And others might have a great example there. I think to the broader point of the role of the community and the broader coalition keeping things in line, or sort of maintaining direction despite upheaval, perhaps in the system, right? So there's a start thing and there's an ongoing thing. I mean, on the ongoing thing, this just sort of veers more to my personal experience into the report specifically, but I think a lot about the time I've spent both living in and doing a lot of work in philanthropy and being involved in some of the stuff going on in Chicago over decades. Now is a very uniquely challenged time for CPS, I would say. But one thing that most people aren't aware of is how much improvement they've seen, right? In the 80s, they were called the worst school system in the country by the Department of the Secretary of Education. I think in the late 2000s, the aughts, right, 2007, 2008, the stat was of 100 ninth graders, 8 of them will finish college by age 25. And there was sort of all sorts of things going on about the change that needed to happen. And then I think if you look as of a year or two ago, graduation rates were close to 80%, and it was more like 22 and growing percent of those ninth graders that will finish college by age 25. By age 25. And when I think of all the players, right, you've got community groups, you've got outside partnerships with universities that are a bit relentless on the data. You've got philanthropists that sort of believe in advancing principal leadership and have their things that they sort of keep their eyes on. I did a chart once of all the disruptions to CPS of superintendent turnover, strike, school closings, certainly not a great example of stakeholder engagement there. Very weird things going on with superintendents at various points, and then some great ones, but you don't see this 12 years of the same person kind of story that we see in international systems. But I think what people would point to, and this felt very strong in sort of the community here in Chicago, was like this, we call it almost the exoskeleton of the things outside the system, that if the system tried to veer too much off the course, that group would help make sure it didn't go too far off the rails. And I think that is one of the reasons you see sustained improvement despite some of the drama. And to me, that points to that question, John, like that role of everybody else, right, outside of the system, of saying, look, we have expectations, we have the data that we can all look at every year and ask what's going on. And we've seen more and more growth of deliberate community inclusion in that, both from the system, frankly, but also from organizations like Kids First Chicago, which I think has been great to see.
Yeah, Kelsey, let me come back to you on this. I'm curious in the communities that you looked at in your research, whether you saw anything about the role that community and community coalitions played. What Doug just talked about was an accountability kind of role. Here's the data. We're still not doing as well as we need to do for our kids. It feels to me like there's also a support role when systems are doing the right thing, then they need some, and sometimes the right thing to do is hard and it doesn't produce immediate results. So what is it that community coalitions have done in your observations, or community supports have done to help this process along?
Yeah, I unfortunately don't know if I have good information on that exact question. I think it was, I mean, don't want to say surface level because we did a lot of interviews to get to this information.
Yeah, of course.
But I think it was more so wanting to identify those practices, because I think, like we were talking about, unfortunately, they're not novel, but a lot of people were craving post-pandemic. What do we do? How do I come back from this? What should I even focus my efforts on? If I get funds, where should I be devoting them? And so I think there was less focus on specifically diving deeper into those practices as to what they look like specifically, but just that was something emphasized as being important, that those school community connections were really, really critical. And in places where that did go well, we did see better than expected growth, or that was still something that districts were citing or schools were citing as very important. But I don't know if we have any information specific to that. Let me double check the report and see though.
Okay, great. Emmy, any thoughts from your observations? You talked about 3 places, but even more broadly, and probably the American context is most helpful here, though if there were international examples of basically community demand and support, that would be instructive as well.
Yeah. This gets a little bit outside of the examples cited in the report, but I think the role of community coalitions demanding change is huge in early childhood education, in particular in the US right now. Across the country, at the municipal and state level in particular, there are dozens of examples now of really robust early childhood education programs that came into existence because of communities demanding them and fighting to make them a reality. One particular example I'll cite is Multnomah County, Oregon, the broader Portland area, where as long ago as I think 2013, they started a community coalition, came together to really start looking at the need for preschool education in Portland and the surrounding communities. They later enlisted an elected official as a champion who helped bring together what became known as the Preschool for All Task Force in Multnomah, which included over 100 people, primarily parents who had a formal accountability role in that task force, and early childhood educators from all different settings and all different types of communities within the county. And that group collectively designed what then became a measure that went on the ballot in 2020. And Multnomah County now has a high income earner tax that specifically funds preschool education and will reach every 3 and 4-year-olds in the county. And it really grew out of this community demand for quality early childhood education as a tool for kindergarten readiness, as a tool to support families, and as an equity tool. And there's a really big focus in the program design on equity, both for families, particularly children of color and children who speak a language other than English at home. And there's also quite a big focus on the educators in settings that have been marginalized in the past. There are dozens of other examples around the country where we've seen that same kind of community demand. And I think particularly as early childhood education becomes something that we don't see federal action on right now, and states and localities are going to continue to drive the way, there is a really clear role for communities to engage in that kind of program design.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Doug, I want to come back to you in a second. I'm going to ask Erica a question, but I just want to come back to you. You put up those barriers to successful implementation, and I'd like to come back to them right after a question for Eric, and think about what it is communities can do to help reduce those barriers. So while you're thinking about that for a second, Eric, if the system's in the middle, we got policy over here, we got community over here. Sometimes the policy works around, work advocacy around policy works around a system, right? You all have ideas. You actually want community support. Communities drive advocacy. So I'm curious how you think about the role of community coalitions, again, in creating the right kind of policy environment for the selection of the right strategies and then the successful implementation of those strategies.
Yeah, I mean, you brought up some really good points, and I think, my colleagues did as well, about the role of advocacy and how important, those community members are and those coalitions are. And, I walked a little bit through our Alliance for Resource Equity Toolkit, but we did a very similar data presentation 7 years ago with a set of state advocates in Maryland, where we sort of talked through, what did the data say? What are the, policy conditions? What are your priorities, and how can we sort of try to infuse that into sort of state level law that will address some of these inequities? And they really drove the the selection of the sort of core priorities and what ultimately ended up being the blueprint in Maryland, addressing some of the inequities that they saw in access to certain teachers and diverse teachers, in experienced school leaders, and access to advanced coursework. All of these sort of areas that they uncovered and that they were extremely passionate about. They sort of uncovered these, led to sort of the inclusion in this big state law. But as we see, and as we brought up with the implementation of it, that's where I think why we engage with communities, because not only can they identify sort of the policy levers and what needs to be prioritized based on their own experiences, based on their own passion about the work and knowledge, but they are the ones now that are continuing to press on the education agency and their districts to implement these policies that were invested in when political leadership has changed, when there's a little fatigue in dealing with some of these issues that were brought up 7 years ago or even 3 or 4 years ago. Community members and that coalition of folks that are from across the state that have different positions but have been there and will continue to be there and will continue to sort of be invested in that community. They're the ones that are driving the implementation and driving the urgency and saying we need to continue to push on this issue, and we need to continue to be very deliberate and direct in how we allocate resources to community members, and to Doug's point, making sure that there's some accountability there. And that's where we really lean on our advocate coalitions when we try to get these big wins. It's like that's the first step. Years later, we're still working with these communities to make sure that this is implemented with fidelity. So it's like the first step.
Right. Well, Doug, that's a perfect segue back to what I want to ask you about, which doesn't have an easy answer, to be sure, for only this easy. But look, here you got a community. Let's say the system does a good job interacting with the community. We select the right strategies, which are the sort of the consensus strategies. Of course, there's an accountability role for the community driven by data. Like, hey, we're not getting where we want to go. Got it. But what all of you have talked about is the hard work of good, high quality implementation over time, not just the spark, but the sustain. And I'm really curious what it looks like for a community to not just hold a system's feet to the fire and, sort of the scold, do a good job on implementation. Not maybe that helpful if you're sitting in the system, right? What can the community coalition do to really create the conditions for successful implementation of the right strategies?
Yeah. Well, let me take a shot at that, but would also recognize there's probably a number of folks on the call and in the chat that have seen things work well and that might be worth sharing. So I would encourage folks, if you have things you've seen hit a home run or a triple at least on this kind of thing, to share those. I think a couple things I would say. You get that, you sort of get things going, right? I think there is that sort of we go through some of these, right? That conflicting directions point, right? That sense that the new superintendent, it'll be what's his or her flavor of the month, right? So this person cared about reading, but that person's all about college readiness, or like it just becomes like they just have different schools of thought. I was in a district once. We were supporting them. This is when I was at the New Teacher Project on teacher recruitment, and they switched superintendents, and one was reorganizing to K-8s and 9-12s. And that was one of his big initiatives. And the day the person came in when he got fired, it was, we're going backwards, right? We're backwards. Maybe I shouldn't say backwards. We're going back. So the whole district had started reorganizing over a year or two to make this change. And it was like, nope, we're going back. We're going back to K-5s, right? And so you can just imagine the churn and stress and like how much time we spend undoing, redoing as a system instead of sort of going forward, right? So there's, I think, a role of thinking about that change that's built for the current moment as like a durable one, which I imagine everyone on the phone is thinking, right? As we're trying to advocate for this isn't about because this person likes it. This is the through line, but how do we build that buy-in in a broader and broader set? So when the new person comes in, you've got everybody in their ear saying, but you're not going to change this, or you're not going to take that away, right? Because we're all agreed that that's really important. So if that's not your favorite topic, sorry, it needs to be, or it needs to be in the top 3 because we are all there. And I think a lot of leaders will see the value of that support and help them keep something top of mind that should be during those transitions. I think, you know, on the stakeholders sideline, that part I've seen with sort of a fear of engagement with stakeholders, a sense of like, well, that's going to slow it down. That's going to make it harder. And oh my gosh, I can imagine this meeting with all these people and these 5 loud people in the back, and it's going to, right. And so it sort of becomes like, look, we got a choice. We can either engage folks, or we can just get it done. Or we can sort of get it done and then engage folks by hoping they buy into what we're doing, but we're not really going to change what we do depending on what they say. And I think there's a role as community leaders, like how can you bend the ear of that leader to say, hey, don't be as afraid as you think, right? Here's some examples where this has actually catalyzed better change or more improvement or made things better, or actually hasn't derailed things the way you're afraid of. Because I think it's that fear of it that causes people to hold back. So I think the thoughtful folks, like the folks on this call, saying like, I get that this is hard and it's worth it, instead of, look, you're either with us or against us, and you sound like one of those against us people, right? So like, how do you at least give it a shot early on? That, you know, that can help. And then the other things, right? Strategy stuck on a shelf, some of the data stuff. I mean, that's sort of the scold and support, right? The scold can be, where is this? Why aren't we talking about this? Why aren't we asking what works? The support can do some of those same things, but a bit with that sort of curiosity instead of antagonism. But it is an important role, because there's a risk. Big initiative, we're all about it, no one ever hears about it again, and someone has to keep asking the question about like, what happened to that money, or what happened to that priority.
Yeah, Eric, you know, coming back to that point around equity, it seems to me from this conversation, and maybe I said it just right, that gaps in implementation quality actually lead to gaps in achievement, the kind of outcomes that we want. And that for kids who are not struggling, who are not living in particularly challenging circumstances, marginalized communities, hey, this all kind of comes and goes, and there's lots of support elsewhere. And if there's a stumble in implementation of something, somehow somebody's going to figure out something to keep that kid on track. And for other kids, the dependence on school and doing things really, really well is way higher. So that while these things feel apart, actually, it to me feels like this is where the equity thing, wait, we can pick the 5 or 6 strategies. Everybody knows those 5 or 6 strategies. We fall apart on implementation. So how can we make this emphasis on high quality implementation actually a core part of the equity play that we're all so interested in?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think we saw that. I think the literacy, you know, Emmy brought up Mississippi and some of the literacy work that they've been doing. I think this, like, the literacy example is a really good one. And again, I'm going to keep going back to the power of advocacy in the communities, right? So, John, you brought up there that, you know, when things kind of fall apart in implementation, or in, you know, when we have school closures, or when we have these issues with a curriculum or an instructional model that maybe doesn't show the outcomes that we want, or lead folks to early literacy outcomes that we want to see. We have certain folks who can go out and get tutoring and go out and get some of the resources that they need to support their students, and others that don't have those resources, right? And so when we start so obviously, you know, when it comes to the sort of challenges in implementation, having the data sort of built into the systemic practices and being able to sort of identify that and continue to highlight that this is an issue that a lot of folks are sort of dealing with, is really important. So that transparency, I think, is huge. And that's where we want to sort of showcase and highlight, like, this may look okay to you guys, just how you feel about it, but the data show that there are huge gaps in certain things, and to be able to sort of unpack that. But then again, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but the role of advocates, yeah, like in the literacy space, you know, again, it was parents, you know, of all background saying, our kids aren't learning how to read. And I have to go out and get more resources. And you have other people who are suffering maybe in silence or in their communities and not necessarily being heard about how little they're, being taught how to read. And so that sort of advocacy, and showing like, look, now we have the data. We see that third graders and fourth graders aren't reading on grade level. And we see that there are certain populations of folks with, the dyslexia community or students of color who have suffered acutely. And so we need to do something. And, there were advocates who said, we're going to go out and figure this out on our own. But when that didn't work, it was, how can we build this into the way our policies and our practices are sort of laid out? And I think that's where we've seen the sort of shift in the literacy space, where we had I think a number of years ago, maybe this issue was being sort of tackled or addressed at the individual level. But when we started to see the data that came out in the stories and the narrative about all of these students who are struggling to learn how to read, then it kind of prompted this change that was, again, driven by advocates saying enough's enough. Like we just can't make this work. So data and then the advocacy community working in concert to elevate the issue and drive change, I think are what we continue to push for. And I think if that model continues, that's I think a good way to sort of support that.
Excellent. Thanks so much. I really appreciate that. I just want to Hillary just posted a short survey, so I hope that folks will fill that out while they're listening. Really helps us. The feedback really helps us to make these sessions as useful as possible to our colleagues in the field. I just want to do a quick lightning round here as we close out on a takeaway around for each of you, both from what you presented and what you heard during the session around, what's the takeaway about promising practices that lead to outcomes, not just, great ideas, but things that lead to outcomes. I think let's mimic where we started and go reverse alphabetical order to close out. Kelsey, box it up, little takeaways, lightning round takeaways from you.
This is the one time where I wish I wasn't going first, so I can just agree with all of my brilliant colleagues. Gosh, lightning round takeaways. I think very, very quick story. I worked at the Department of Education for a long time, transitioned from academia to there. And it took me a while to get my bearings to understand the implementation was such a key factor for them. We added a survey that looked at their attitudes toward the practices we were changing, the norm, and their control over engaging in that behavior if they were going to change practice. Attitude was great. They loved what we were teaching them. And so I think of that with the practices we're sharing today. Everyone knows it works. Yay. How do we do it? Where they felt a lack was a norm. Everyone's engaging in this, everyone's doing this, or control over engaging in that behavior. And so I think listening to these system level changes, knowing we're in agreement on what these behaviors are, that there's a need to empower our educators and set up systems and a norm that this is an expectation that's being reinforced at this district and cultural level. That's my, as fast as possible.
That was good. Doug?
Mine would be to circle back. I think, John, something you said about the innovation, implementation is the new innovation, right? I think there's always, because of all of our impatience and desire to change things, not just for students 20 years from now, but for students sitting in classrooms today, we all want here's the thing. And, ed tech, now it's going to be AI. And no doubt those things have and will shape things. But, it's not, the implementation is not the glamorous part, right? But sort of the we're gonna coach all the teachers in Mississippi versus we're gonna have a high quality strategy, train those coaches well, make sure they know what they're doing. Both of those things sound the same, but the impact is radically different. And so I think it's encouraging to be having this conversation and hearing sort of very different voices and perspectives, but coming back to this point of it's almost like settled for the most part what we need to do. And can we have a little bit more glamour and excitement and give big kudos to someone who implements a plan great, not just comes up with a great plan.
Awesome. Emmy?
I'll just double down on what Doug said. I was looking back for a moment and wanted to just share from the report. If we think back to those sort of how levers, the 6 strategies that we had up on the screen,
Yeah.
when we surveyed education systems around the world, what we found is that systems that employed all of those levers were 6 times more likely to be successful in achieving the goals of their education reform or transformation than folks who did not employ those levers. And what I think that really just emphasizes is this point that Doug is making. Like, true education transformation is not sexy. There is no silver bullet. It is really hard work focused on implementing the strategy that works. And I think here an important detail and something for us to just all collectively think about as we move forward in coming years is the importance of having really capable talent at every level. And that's, in classrooms and respecting the profession of educators. That's who do you have leading schools in the principal's seat and what supports do they have? And it's, and this is where I also have a love and a bias. It's who do you have in the sort of central office, in the system administrator at a district, city, state, national level? And how do we make sure that we're emphasizing the importance of capacity in all of those types of roles with an eye to implementation?
Takes me back, Kelsey, to something that you said, which is if we have to do everything, like what Emmy says is you can't just do one thing and do it well. You have to do all these things and you have to do all of them well, which is a heck of a lot to ask. And that's never going to happen unless you have that culture shift that you talked about at the very top. And that mindset is supported by the community. That expectation is set, but also that folks are in it for a long haul to support those who are making those changes. My friend Eric, you get the last word.
I'm going to steal what Kelsey said, and I'm sorry to do this to you, Kelsey, but I couldn't agree more with my colleagues. Everybody has said such brilliant things. And John, I was going to bring up the point of the role of communities and advocates in sustaining change, in addition to creating it. So, yeah, sorry,
Fantastic. I just want to thank you, Eric, Kelsey, Emmy, Doug. Thanks so much. Thanks to Hillary and to Leah for helping make this happen. Thanks to everybody for joining us today. And I will turn it back to you, to Leah, to close out. But just a warm thank you and a good holidays to all. Thanks so much.
Thank you. So in wrapping up, join us next week for Childcare Has Shifted. Are we ready for the future? Then on December 24th and December 31st, we have 2 holiday rebroadcasts from GLR Week and our Big Bets Working Series. And then join us on January 7th if you're interested in hearing a little bit about sustaining progress and academic recovery and early school success in our current political environment. And so we hope that you'll sign up and join us for one of those sessions and tell us how you're using the work, the information you learned today in your own community, places, and spaces. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you one more time to our panelists. It was a pleasure to be here with all of you.